vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Good afternoon, you're watching The Discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. Do we treat the NHS like a religion? What is a woman? Was Mary Whitehouse right? And as Hungarians go to the polls to vote in their parliamentary elections today, we look at what 4 more years of Viktor Orban could mean for Hungary and the international community. And of course, we give you the latest analysis on the conflict in Ukraine. But first, here's the bulletins.
Good afternoon, it's 3 o'clock. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Ukraine's foreign minister is accusing Russia of carrying out a deliberate massacre in the town of Bucha outside Kyiv. Dmitry Kuleba is calling on G7 leaders to impose devastating new sanctions on Moscow. The UK's Foreign Secretary says indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. Liz Truss insists those responsible must face justice in the International Criminal Court. The mayor of Bucha described Russian troops leaving the bodies of dead civilians in the streets.
Corpses of executed people still line the Yabolsk street in Bucha. Their hands are tied behind their backs. We will record this page of our history and it will be used at their tribunal. But I wouldn't like to talk about that now. You should understand what emotion of relief we are feeling now.
Well, NATO's Secretary-General has warned Russia's pullback of troops from Ukraine's capital is not a real withdrawal. Speaking to CNN, Jens Stoltenberg warned Moscow could be repositioning its forces for further attacks. It's after President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's strengthening Ukraine's defences in the east of the country. Plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia's defence ministry claims strikes have destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages there. President Zelensky says Moscow wants to take control of the east of Ukraine.
We're strengthening our defences in the east of the Donbass. We're aware the enemy has resources to put pressure on the eastern part of the country. What is the aim of the Russian armed forces? They want to seize both the Donbass and the south of our country. What's our aim? To defend our freedom, our land, our people. To do everything to repel them.
Well, further attempts to evacuate people from the besieged city of Mariupol are ongoing today. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk says buses are attempting to get as close as possible to the besieged city, but the situation on the ground is being called volatile. Tens of thousands of residents are trapped there with food and water in short supply. More than 200 people have been arrested as climate change protests enter their 3rd day at various oil terminals across the UK. Officers say the arrests were for offences including criminal damage, obstructing the highway and public order. Activists from Just Stop Oil are demanding the government end new oil and gas projects. Warwickshire Police say a significant operation remains ongoing at Kingsbury. At least 6 people have been killed and 10 others injured after a shooting in the US state of California. Police have closed off several streets in the city of Sacramento while they investigate. It comes just over a month after a man shot and killed his 3 children, a 4th person and himself at a church in the city. Sacramento Police Chief Catherine Lester says officers were in the area and heard the shots fired.
They found a very large crowd here, and they also found that we had a number of people that were shot in the area. Those officers, we know, rendered aid to our victims and called for additional assistance from outside agencies as well as our medical responders with the local fire department.
Pakistan's president has dissolved parliament and called early elections following an opposition attempt to remove Prime Minister Imran Khan from office. It comes after a no-confidence vote in Mr Khan was blocked by Parliament's deputy speaker. The former cricketer, who was elected in 2018, believes the move to oust him was orchestrated by the US, a claim Washington denies. A new treatment for liver cancer, which isolates the organ and protects other parts of the body, has been found to be effective in nearly 90% of patients. The procedure involves using 2 small balloons to divert blood past the liver while delivering drugs directly into the organ. Doctors say the technique, being pioneered at University Hospital Southampton, is better than standard chemotherapy, which can cause damage elsewhere in the body. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's return to Inaya.
According to research from the National Centre for Social Research, public satisfaction with the NHS has collapsed to lowest levels since 1997, with just 36% of voters content with the way the service is run and performing. This comes after the publication of the damning Oakenden report this week, which detailed the distressing story of the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS, where catastrophic failures in maternity care contributed to hundreds of babies needlessly dying or suffering life-changing injuries. Critics of the NHS have argued that our sacralisation of the institution obscures our ability to make proper assessments of its effectiveness and enact the radical reforms that may be necessary for its improvement. However, others have argued that the NHS cannot solely be blamed for what is a political failing of underfunding and understaffing. Therefore, can we speak frankly and honestly about the problems of the NHS? And what are those problems and how do we fix them? Well, joining me to discuss this is Paul Gallagher, health correspondent for iNews, firstly. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Paul. I mean, firstly, what's your reaction to the shocking report about maternity care that was published this week?
Like many, it was just jaw-dropping, really. I mean, we've had several reports over the last 10, 20 years detailing failings at various NHS trusts, but this one was particularly shocking given the scale over a 20-year period, the number of babies who died, 201, 9 mothers, and the fact that these problems were raised by the families themselves, who were continuously ignored until just a few years ago when Donna Ockenden announced that she was going to be launching that review into what happened at Shrewsbury and Telford. And one of the most shocking things I found was the problems are still exist at the trust today. It's been rated inadequate by the Care Quality Commission. It's been that way for a few years. They've gone through 5 chief executives before the current chief executive was imposed. Those 5 chief executives have gone on to do very, very well in the health service, be it the public sector or the private part of the health service. And there doesn't seem to be, or there certainly wasn't, any kind of accountability over the years. And the fact that the current staff were telling Donna Ockenden that they'd been told not to talk to her or her investigators just smacks of a desire to cover up the truth. And that is one of the worst failings of the NHS, I have to say, is this inability to acknowledge where things have gone wrong, to listen to whistleblowers whenever they emerge, and to put in place change immediately if something as serious as this crops up. It was just a catalogue of failings and a litany of errors for over a 20-year period, really. One of the worst reviews that there has been, probably easily the biggest scandal in maternity in the NHS.
And Paul, who do you think is responsible for this? I mean, do you blame the government at all? Because some people do point to long-term failures in public policy in dealing with this issue. And do you agree with what I was saying in the introduction, that actually oftentimes the way we talk about the NHS is almost deified, and it could perhaps obscure our ability to talk frankly and openly about its problems?
I think it's a combination of both. So 10 years of austerity certainly hasn't helped. There's historic understaffing of the NHS. In England alone, there's roughly 93,000 vacancies. It has had more money in recent years, but it's very, very much playing catch up. You've seen the waiting lists for non-urgent treatment now reaching 6.1 million people. So there has been a decade of political problems. However, as you mentioned, the Ockenden Review, that stretches back 20 years during a period where the NHS was financed, was getting bigger year on year, extra money in its budget than had been the case in recent years. So it's a combination of both a lack of investment, but also a bad management, quite frankly. I mentioned the 5 managers there who've gone on to work in other trusts and other parts of the healthcare and earn substantial salaries as a result of doing that. And we've already seen the maternity scandal at Morecambe Bay. There's a review underway in East Kent. There's a review underway in Nottingham.
And Paul, I mean, what do you think in terms of the solution? I think he's frozen there. We'll just quickly go to Emma Webb, who is with us in the studio. Hopefully we can get Paul back just to finish some of the things that he was saying. But political commentator Emma Webb is with me in the studio. What's your reaction, to some of the reports that have come out? I mean, do you think that we need to be looking at alternative health models? Because we constantly have this cycle of reports and devastating reactions, and now we are seeing that the confidence in the NHS from the public is reducing, but there isn't seemingly the political will to do something about it.
Yeah, I think you were right in your introduction when you described it as the sacralising of the NHS, because I think often we have been blinded by our own faith in the NHS to ways in which it could be reformed. And, it's a false belief to think that the NHS is the only health service around the world that is free at the point of delivery, being able to access it without it having a negative impact on your finances. There are many models all around the world in most developed countries except for the USA. And often I think people only speak in terms of either the NHS or the American model. And the American model is an extreme example of the absolute opposite of the NHS. And I think sometimes we are blinded to how it could be reformed to make it better and more efficient. And I think people are afraid to do that because it has become this kind of sacred cow. And I don't think that that's in the best interest of the public. And I think as time goes on, confidence in the NHS will continue to decline when reports like the Ockenden report that's just been released, but also when we see what the ultimate consequences have been for, care for, say, cancer patients during COVID, things like that. So I think ultimately faith in the NHS will decline if we continue to fail to be able to have the sorts of discussions that we need in order to reform it, to make it actually work for the public and have the best health outcomes.
Well, we'll come back to you, Emma, with more of your thoughts. And apologies for the technical difficulties. And thank you, Paul Gallagher, health correspondent for iNews, for sharing his thoughts earlier. We're now also joined by Nigel Cameron, President Emeritus at the Centre for Policy and Emerging Technologies. I don't know if you've heard some of the discussion that we've had, Nigel. I mean, what's your thoughts? I mean, do you think that we treat the NHS like a deity and that prevents us from being able to discuss its problems frankly? And do you think that we should be looking at alternative healthcare models?
Oh, sure. I mean, the curious situation is that the situation in Britain is now not in anybody's interest. It's not in patients' interests. It's not in government or even opposition interests to have things as they are. Because this is the only country in the world where when you have an election, everyone is jumping up and down and complaining about healthcare. I mean, I live now most of the time in Brussels and also in France. And I mean, European countries all have systems in which you don't pay seriously for medicine, in which you have a mix of private and public involved, and in which you have an election and it just isn't a political issue. I mean, what governments have done in Britain by playing on this sacralizing issue is to take the issue into a sort of special sphere. So you really can't have a rational conversation about healthcare in Britain. But every time a government comes up for re-election, it's in trouble. So I think really it should be a bipartisan interest in getting this thing off the political agenda and also in breaking up the system. And look at random statistics. Germany spends twice as much per cancer patient as Britain. When the pandemic began, it had 7 times as many ICU beds. We need to get interested in things like that.
Well, Nigel, I mean, how do we detoxify the conversation, so to speak? As Emma alluded to, oftentimes when we do talk about alternatives, the first thing that is said is the American model, and it's painted as this kind of scare story where people, even when they're sick and needing emergency, no one's picking them up. And we can't differentiate between all of the different systems, and perhaps we need to be comparing ourselves to Europe, as you have done already. I mean, what can be done in order to actually open up the conversation, seemingly as it's so heated at the moment?
Well, I think 2 things. I mean, I love what Emma said. She was absolutely right. I mean, one thing is, it's curious, in the Americans and the Brits, one thing they really have in common is they love to slag off the other's healthcare system. And in a sense, the Americans need the NHS, socialized medicine. What was it I saw this week? Someone given an appointment for autism in 5 years' time. They love those sort of statistics. The Americans love being able to make these complaints about the NHS. The NHS loves the notion that the only alternative is the US, which is crackers. We should stop doing that. And secondly, as Emma says, we've got to get really interested in comparative healthcare in Europe. I mean, no discussion should ever be allowed. There should be no editorials, no investigatory articles without a heavy focus on what the alternative systems are typically within Europe. You may hate the EU, but every EU member has a system in which you basically get free healthcare, and they're all different, and they're all hybrid, and none of them has this craziness which we have the NHS.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Nigel Cameron, President Emeritus at the Centre of Policy on Emerging Technologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the question, what is a woman, has become a question of intense political discussion in the UK and America of late. I'm not a biologist, said US Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson when asked. In the UK, politicians of all stripes fall over themselves on a daily basis attempting to answer this question, with some enthusiastically proclaiming the answer is an adult human female, whilst others, such as Mayor of London Sadiq Khan, accusing those who ask the question of being, quote, in danger of inciting hatred against people. For many ordinary people, the idea that this has become such a heated topic of discussion is baffling, to say the least. But with gender ideology seeking to replace sex difference with the psychological sense of gender identity in law, policy and social relations, the answer to the question, what is a woman, has far-reaching consequences. Well, joining me to discuss this is Colin Wright, evolutionary biologist and contributing editor of Quillette magazine. Thank you for joining me, Colin. In your understanding, what is a woman, first of all?
So it's pretty simply straightforward. A woman is an adult human female. And as a biologist, I can break each of those down very quickly. So an adult is any member of a species that reached their average age of reproduction for members of their species. A human is a member of the species Homo sapiens. We used to have other species like Neanderthals who may have been able to reproduce with humans, and they would have been considered Homo sapiens as well, but they no longer exist. So humans are pretty self-contained and a single species. And then a female is someone whose reproductive anatomy is organized around, through development, the production of small gametes or eggs, as we tend to know them. We're living through a sort of a weird time because scientists and people generally used to be known for being very careful to not pretend to know things they didn't know. But out of political correctness, we're in a space now where scientists are seeming to pretend to not know things that they absolutely do know now. So it's been an interesting inversion.
I said on Twitter a couple hours ago that I'm not fully convinced about the very clear distinction between sex and gender, as often trans rights activists and gender critical feminists put, that biology, sex is biology, and gender is social roles and is a social construct. I mean, do you agree with me, or do you agree with other people that these distinctions aren't often as simple as we would lay them out to be, and perhaps that's caused some of the confusion, or maybe they're the same thing?
So it really depends on how people define gender. So as a biologist, I tend to let people define gender how they want to, and they can just tell me what their definition is. But when we're talking about biological sex, as a biologist, that's my realm. And when we're talking about whether someone's male or female, it has to do with their primary reproductive organs and whether or not they're organized around the production of small or large gametes. Now, gender, some people hold this to be just a pure identity. Sometimes it's identifying with the stereotypes of masculinity or femininity. Some people talk about gender as just being evolved differences in behavior. There's all kinds of ways, or a social construct based on people's perceived sex. So there's all kinds of definitions for gender out there. Some just equate it with sex as well. So it really just, you have to ask people what they mean by gender. But for sex, that is a very specific defined term within science. And so that's what I just try to maintain as being, make sure we are all understanding what that is, and then we can talk about what things that it isn't.
And radical feminists increasingly in the UK are now seeing this issue as a defining issue for them politically. Like I've seen increasingly feminists that I know that say that they will not vote for a particular political party or individual if they cannot answer that question clearly. I mean, do you think that the inability to answer that question on the part of some individuals, cultural and political figures, actually shows a sign of their cowardice, or it makes you question them politically if they're not able to answer what for most people are quite simple questions?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, women's rights has been a huge issue for decades, if not centuries. And, when people in the US and other places, when women weren't allowed to vote, no one questioned what a woman was. Everyone knew that a woman was based on the reproductive biology and not their identity. You couldn't just identify as gender fluid, walk up to a voting booth and claim that you identified as a man that day to vote. When a sexist is going to be sexist towards a woman, they don't ask what their pronouns are before they treat them differently in society. So we know what a woman is. And this seeming pretending to not know what that is out of this sense of political correctness, or that it's politically damaging, well, to me, that should just be a major red flag, that this is a candidate that's not going to uphold any sort of civil rights that I think women definitely deserve and have fought really hard for in the past.
Well, thank you so much, Colin Wright, evolutionary biologist and contributing editor of Quillette magazine. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Well, coming up, was Mary Whitehouse right? And as Hungarians go to the polls to vote in the upcoming parliamentary elections, we look at what 4 more years of Viktor Orban can mean for Hungary and the international community. And of course, we'll give you the latest analysis of the conflict in Ukraine. But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry with sunny spells for most, but rain edging in from the northwest. Let's take a look at those details. The southwest will end the day mostly dry with plenty of sunny spells on offer. The odd isolated light shower is possible, but it will be a fine evening for most. It will also be a fine and dry Sunday evening for the southeast. There'll be some fair weather cloud and plenty of sunny spells. Sunny spells will be plentiful across South Wales this evening too. Winds will be mainly light, and there'll be a little fair weather cloud. There'll also be a little more cloud across the Midlands, but there'll also be some bright or sunny spells. An isolated light shower is possible, but for most it will remain dry. It's a different story across north-east England, where cloud will be increasing as rain gradually edges in from the north. The winds will also start to increase here through the evening. The wet weather will already be in place across southern Scotland this evening. The rain will be patchy in nature and turn heavy at times, with strong gusty winds too. Northern Ireland will also be cloudy, with patchy outbreaks of rain edging southeastwards through the evening. The winds will also be strengthening here, especially around coastal areas where gales are possible. The cloud, rain and strengthening winds will continue to edge steadily southeast overnight, reaching all areas by the morning. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Welcome back. And before we get into the next discussion about Mary Whitehouse, I just want to get your reaction, Emma, to the debate that we just had with Colin about this whole discussion about what is a woman. It seems like every single day now politicians are asked by various broadcasters and journalists what the definition is, and it is fascinating to see their reaction every time that's asked.
It's become the go-to gotcha question, and I think one of the reasons why, other than the obvious reason that it's of importance to the public debate, I think one of the other reasons why that question keeps getting asked is because of the way the politicians respond. They react as if they are frightened and want to jump behind the couch and hide from the question because it is the most frightening thing that they could possibly have been asked. And I think it is because, you know, it's a thorny and complicated issue when you bore really deep down into it. And for most people, it's a very straightforward, simple thing that a woman is an adult human female, and whether you're a male or a female is an issue to do with sex. But because of all of the sort of definitional complexities around gender for the gender activists, that whole way of thinking is almost a worldview unto itself, and it's almost like a religion with a doctrine and all of the complexities that go along with that. And I think that can be a very daunting thing for a politician that knows that they need to kowtow to something that they feel that they need to kowtow to something that they don't really fully understand. Mm-hmm. And for them, ultimately, it's going to be a lose-lose situation, because on the one hand, they'll be hounded by activists, a very small number of activists who hold a very radical view of gender ideology, versus the majority of the population who hold views that we've held for millennia and that are very, very straightforward. And so what you end up with is these politicians equivocating radically, and that makes them appear to be untrustworthy because they are equivocating on a question that they should really be able to straightforwardly answer.
Well, in a somewhat similar subject, Banned, the Mary Whitehouse story, is a BBC documentary which aired this week, which sought to re-examine the legacy of Mary Whitehouse, the infamous late 20th century conservative activist who campaigned very strongly against social liberalism in the mainstream British media. Whitehouse passionately argued that we were creating a permissive society where liberal sexual attitudes that were harmful to women, children and society as a whole. Whitehouse's campaign continues to divide opinion, however, with debates reigniting over the role and the impact of porn, casual sex and the proper relationship between men and women. Was Mary Whitehouse right? Well, my next guest is Louise Perry, freelance writer and campaigner. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Louise. I mean, what's your thoughts? Do you think Mary Whitehouse was right?
On some things, yes. So the things that she was wrong on, just to get those out of the way, she definitely was, I think, really sincerely homophobic. It was one of the first pieces that she wrote for the Times, was a piece on how mothers could dissuade their sons from being gay, right? So she was, even I think for her era, she was unusually homophobic. And that's something that it is important to remember about her. She also, in a sense, was, the original cancel culture campaigner, in that she would work really hard to cancel, even to send to prison sometimes people who committed blasphemy, for instance, in her eyes. So famously, the Oz magazine, Mary Whitehouse was involved in the campaign against the cartoonists who created blasphemous images and used really archaic legislation to go after them. So, on that front, I think history has decided that, against Mary Whitehouse. But there were some things that actually she's proved to be really prescient on, and that's what the documentary is so interesting on, and drawing those out. There's this great scene in the first episode at the end, which is archive footage of Mary Whitehouse speaking at the Cambridge Union at the beginning of the 1980s, and speaking about the ways in which porn is made for and by men, and the way that it harms women. And you hear the students groaning in the background because it's like, this fuddy-duddy. But she was right. And of course, 40 years on, it's even more obvious that she was right, and more obvious that she was prescient in the direction she saw all of this taking, because, the point that she made, and she was right, is that advertisers and TV and film producers and so on have an incentive to sexualize their content, because it makes it more, and it also increase both sex and violence to their content, because it's eye-catching, it's stimulating, it attracts viewers, it improves ratings, all of this. And if there's no limit on their ability to do that, they will just keep ramping up the level of sex and violence. And that is what's happened. We've seen the norms shift so radically just within the last sort of 40 years. Like, people forget, for instance, that the famous Wonder Bra ad with the woman looking down at her boosted cleavage, which supposedly caused car accidents because men were so distracted by this image, which was really novel at the time, to have something that's like salacious in the public realm. That was in the 90s. And now the idea of anyone crashing their car, or even like diverting their gaze towards images of models in lingerie in public, is insane, because that's just so normalised.
Yeah, I mean, but finally, Louise, I mean, people would push back and say that actually the social liberalising, the sexual liberalising has, as you alluded to, actually allowed for LGBT people to express themselves in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, but also women, that they now have more choices, that they don't have to have one path, one sexual path, and all of that decided for them, that they have, with freedom comes risk and responsibility, but better that they have that freedom than otherwise not.
I mean, it's both, right? There have been upsides to sexual liberalism as well as downsides, but I think I'd query the idea that women now necessarily have more freedom. I think what's happened is just that the cultural script has changed. And now, instead of obeying norms, more old-fashioned norms about, not having premarital sex and so on, we now have a new set of norms, which, for instance, mandate hookup culture for young women, which is now quite a hard thing to say no to. So I'd say that actually I'm not sure there is more freedom now. I think there's just been a change, and that change has not entirely been to women's benefit.
Well, thank you so much, Louise Perry, writer and campaigner. Just after the break, we'll be looking at Hungary and giving the update on the latest with the conflict in Ukraine, just after the news bulletins.
Thank you, Inaya. It's 3:33. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Ukraine's foreign minister is accusing Russia of carrying out a deliberate massacre in the town of Bucha outside Kyiv. Dmitry Kuleba is calling on G7 leaders to impose devastating new sanctions on Moscow. The UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says indiscriminate attacks on civilians in parts of Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. The mayor of Bucha described Russian troops leaving the bodies of dead civilians in the streets.
Corpses of executed people still line the Yablsk street in Bucha. Their hands are tied behind their backs. We will record this page of our history and it will be used at their tribunal, but I wouldn't like to talk about that now. You should understand what emotion of relief we are feeling now.
NATO's Secretary-General has warned Russia's pullback of troops from Ukraine's capital is not a real withdrawal. Speaking to CNN, Jens Stoltenberg warned Moscow could be repositioning its forces for further attacks. It's after President Volodymyr Zelensky said he's strengthening Ukraine's defences in the east of the country. Plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia's defence ministry claims strikes have destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages there. At least 6 people have been killed and 10 others injured after a shooting in the US state of California. Police have closed off several streets in the city of Sacramento while they investigate. It comes just over a month after a man shot and killed his 3 children, a 4th person and himself at a church in the city. And a new treatment for liver cancer, which isolates the organs and protects the other parts of the body, has been found to be effective in nearly 90% of patients. The procedure involves using 2 small balloons to divert blood past the liver while delivering drugs directly into the organ. It's being pioneered in the UK at the University Hospital, Southampton. You're up to date for now. We'll have more of the main stories at the top of the next hour.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. Today, the people of Hungary go to the polls to vote in their national parliamentary elections. A couple of weeks ago on the show, we covered the key figures in the parliamentary election and examined the incumbent President Viktor Orban's promotion of a so-called illiberal democracy. Now, we'd like to discuss more what 4 more years of Viktor Orban could look like for Hungarian society and foreign affairs, and alternatively, what a victory for the opposition could mean also. Let's get more on this now from Alex Faludi, who is a freelance journalist. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Alex. Firstly, what are the polls saying? Is it very close, or is Orban looking quite strong in terms of a victory for this election?
This is looking a lot closer than many of us had anticipated. In the polls published yesterday, the United Opposition, or United for Hungary, and Fidesz were neck and neck on 47% each. Now, there are various advantages for Fidesz in terms of the mechanics of the structure of the electoral system, but nonetheless, victory is less far away from the opposition than might be expected. So they would need, if they had competed the 2018 election as United Bloc like they are doing now, they would have won 95 seats out of the 199, and to secure a majority, a bare majority in the parliament, they would need to improve on that result by a further 5 seats. And there are 7 seats available where Fidesz has a majority of less than 1,000. So less than 2%, and 10 where Fidesz's majority is less than 3%, which is within the famous polling margin of error. The consensus amongst analysts in Budapest, from think tanks and from academia, has tended to be that Fidesz would be returned, but without the 2/3 majority that allows it to amend the constitution unilaterally. That it would have to govern on a bare majority, which would be a first since 2010. But we can't be absolutely sure, and it is a little bit nail-biting today.
And what do you think Orban's reaction will be? Would he change his tack if he does get a substantially reduced majority to the one that he currently holds?
Well, of course, because he's cemented so many of his policies into the Constitution and into cardinal laws annexed to the Constitution, the extent to which it limits his room for manoeuvre is debatable. And if the far-right Mihozonk party, meaning our homeland, were to breach the parliamentary threshold, were to get in 5%, he could probably rely on their support. They've always supported him on major questions in parliamentary votes, and the representative of the ethnic German minority in Hungary would also support the government, we expect. So it might not make that much of a difference, except symbolically, because being able to say that he had the 2/3 mandate was a very powerful thing rhetorically, both domestically and internationally. I think we can expect some changes after the election if Fidesz wins. There will probably be some reshuffle of ministers, and in particular there is a perception that the foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, is a bit of a liability for Orban because of the closeness of his ties to Russia and to the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. So he might be a sacrificial victim in terms of any post-election reshuffle. I should just correct one thing that was said earlier, which is that Orban is not the president, he's the prime minister. The current president is János Áder, and he will soon be succeeded by Katalin Novák, who is, up till now, Orban's deputy leader of Fidesz, but is being elevated to president of the Republic. And should the opposition win, that will create a problem for them, because we could expect Katalin Novák to use her veto powers as president quite extensively. And that would be a considerable vulnerability in the parliamentary process for them.
No, thank you. Do you think that the international community will soften to Hungary, given their response to refugees that seemingly has challenged the perception of Hungary as perhaps a closed, insular, xenophobic society? I mean, do you think it might soften?
I think that Hungary's wider public perception improves as a result of the generous response to Ukrainian refugees. I think there are other difficulties for Hungary's relationship with Western powers, including Orbán's reluctance to close down the energy cooperation with Russia on the Poksh nuclear power plant, and even more, the presence of the International Investment Bank, the Russian International Investment Bank in Budapest, all of whose staff enjoy full diplomatic immunity and access to the Schengen zone, and which is a concern for a number of NATO partners in terms of potentially being a cover for Russian intelligence operations that the Hungarians don't seem to want to expel from Budapest. And Hungary has not withdrawn its investments from the bank in the way that some of its Central and East European neighbours have since the invasion of Ukraine, I think. So that would be a continued area of friction between Budapest and Brussels, Washington and London.
Well, thank you so much for bringing us that insight, Alex Faludi, freelance journalist. Thank you so much. I'm just going to bring in Emma Webb, who's still with me in the studio. Just a reaction both from about the Mary Whitehouse story, but then afterwards Hungary. So, I mean, do you think Mary Whitehouse was right? I mean, you know, when I see these videos of her, clearly a woman that's very passionate, believes in very strongly in the things that she says. But I think sometimes I worry that we are rewriting history to suggest that this ultra-conservative society that existed before the sex revolution was in some way beneficial for the majority of women who, a lot of them wanted to remove those barriers to their sexual freedom. I mean, what do you think? Do you agree with me or Mary Whitehouse?
I agree with Louise Perry. I think that she's absolutely right. And I watched the documentary myself and thought exactly the same thing, that Mary Whitehouse was right about some things and wrong about other things. I obviously disagree very strongly with her approach of trying to get things cancelled, taken off air, and this sort of very censorship-heavy approach to the things that she objected to. But in the sense that she saw changes in her society that were moving the UK away from a solidly Christian culture and Christian manners towards an increased liberalisation and permissiveness. I think in many ways she was actually prophetic and ahead of her time in anticipating some of the problems that would come with that. And if you look at it from her perspective and how she saw her society changing, in that respect, if you look at the sort of society that we are today, in many respects sometimes anti-Christian in our values and manners, then you would say that she was absolutely right. But she also...
But there was problems for women even under the system we had, which was overwhelmingly Christian even before then. You know, many women that got pregnant out of wedlock would be completely, you know, marginalised, oftentimes blamed, and the men would be let off scot-free. And so there's many ways in which under a hyper-religious Christian Orthodox society that women can often feel that they don't have the same opportunities and treatment and attitudes as men has.
Yeah, I think that liberalism has brought with it many good things, as well as many things that we should be discussing in terms of the downsides that has, not only for society at large, but for individuals and for women particularly. I think Mary Whitehouse threw into her big bag of concerns lots of different things, and some of them were on the mark and some of them weren't. And I think that, as I say, from her perspective and the way that she saw society changing, she was right. If she, you know, she didn't want that to be the society that we would become. I think she was right in predicting that was the direction that society was taking, and that was something that she disagreed with. I also think that in many respects she was right about the excesses of liberalism, as Louise Perry was saying there, that, you know, many of the things that she discussed, particularly in that Cambridge Union debate surrounding women and porn and sexual morality, are things that we are now discussing, that she was far, far ahead of her time in foreseeing those problems approaching. And I think in that respect, we should, as with all historical figures, take a nuanced approach where we say, you know, in some cases that she was right, and in other instances she was wrong.
Very interesting. Well, to get now the latest on Ukraine, as Russian forces retreat from areas near Kiev. Evidence of civilian killings is mounting in the town of Bucha near Kiev. A journalist from AFP news agency has identified more than 20 corpses, many of which were scattered on the street and dressed in civilian clothing. British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has supported calls to investigate this, amongst other chilling reports, as a possible war crime. As peace talks continue, Kiev and its allies have expressed doubt over Russia's genuine commitment to talks, noting there had been no real sign of the partial military pullback in northern Ukraine as had been promised. However, AFP reports that Ukraine's peace negotiator David Arakhamia said Russia verbally accepts the Ukrainian position on peace talks, except for the issue of Crimea, and that Moscow had agreed that a referendum on the neutral status of Ukraine, quote, will be the only way out of this situation. Therefore, what are the options for Ukraine and the prospect for peace in the near future? Joining me now to discuss this is Philip Cunliffe, Senior Lecturer in International Conflict at the University of Kent. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Philip. I mean, what do you sense in terms of where we're at with the conflict? I mean, is the discussions about the possibility of neutrality for Ukraine a good thing, or actually perhaps a worrying concession?
I think I think neutrality is probably the best option for Ukraine, both in terms of resolving the conflict and also for Ukraine's future in Europe. I think it would make sense, for it to be a neutral country. So the fact that it seems to be gaining ground in terms of being accepted, being promoted by the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and also something which Russia seems willing to accept, that seems hopeful. But on the other hand, given the recent reports about the Russians retrenching and regrouping their forces in order to be able to focus on eastern Ukraine, so even if they're withdrawing from Kiev, which, as you just mentioned, the reports are contradictory and ambiguous, but even if they are, it doesn't suggest that the war is over. But the fact of neutrality, at least, that seems to me to be the most likely and also the most viable option for ending the conflict in a way that hopefully doesn't mean more suffering and death.
On that point about neutrality, what do you think about the West prior to this conflict? Because it has been argued that they have talked up the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union, and now, and that has kind of raised expectations of Ukrainians. And therefore now there is a suggestion that that is the most viable option, almost contradicting what the West had talked up previously, and in a strange way, supporting what was Russia's original demand of wanting Ukraine to be neutral. Doesn't that show some of the kind of contradictions in the West's response and actions over the last few years?
I think so. I mean, it speaks to the opportunism of Western foreign policy and also just how irresponsible it has been. Because, as you say, I mean, they've been effectively dangling the prospect of membership for NATO and the EU before Ukraine, but without actually preparing any serious contingency plans or engaging in any kind of serious planning to actually absorb Ukraine within those institutions, precisely because they knew that it would be a red line for Russia. So we had the worst of all possible worlds, where they were encouraging the Ukrainians to hope, where in fact there was no serious possibility of Ukraine joining. And so I think that has played its part in helping to precipitate the war. So the fact that now the Ukrainians are offering neutrality as a way to hopefully as part of kind of beating Russia back, as well as helping ensure that Russia doesn't invade again in future or try to sabotage or subvert Ukraine in future, short of invasion. That seems to me to be, at least, given how grim the situation is, it's at least perhaps a ray of hope for the resolution of the war.
And do you think that things should change within Western society following this conflict? We know that Germany has remilitarized. There's been discussions in relation to energy independence across Europe, and also big questions over American kind of military, cultural and political hegemony on the world stage, and people no longer seeing them as a global policeman. I mean, do you think this has fundamentally shifted the international order?
I think it's a mark of the world in which we've been living it, which some people called the end of history, because it was supposedly the last 30 years was so kind of peaceful and stable. I mean, obviously, that was kind of a myth to a great degree, but nonetheless, a lot of people felt that it was a remarkably kind of peaceful, an orderly era, and that time is definitively over. So I think it is a kind of a new international order, but unfortunately I don't think it's one that's going to be particularly positive. I mean, if we do have greater energy, say energy security and energy independence, it's only come at the cost of greater geopolitical confrontation and greater rivalry and conflict, and so that doesn't seem to me to be in any kind of way a win. And on the question of Western societies and their views about international order and conflict, I mean, I think part of the most chilling aspect of this, at least in Britain, rather than what's happening here, it seems to me there are plenty of people who still see Putin as the fount of all evil in the world, and they're happy to fight to the last Ukrainian in order to revenge themselves on Putin for Trump and for Brexit and for all the kind of things which Putin is attributed to have done in British politics. And that, to me, is deeply disturbing. And so we shouldn't be displacing our own internal problems onto other countries, which is what many commentators, many analysts and politicians seem to be doing at the moment here.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Philip Cunliffe, Senior Lecturer in International Conflict at the University of Kent. Just quick reaction from you about what Philip said and just the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Well, I think that you mentioned the end of history there, and I think the idea of the end of history allowed us to take democracy for granted, and I think we sat on our laurels as a result of that, and that's led to some serious strategic mistakes. And there's a very interesting article in The Telegraph by Charles Moore where he was talking about the response of Thatcher and Reagan to the conflict over the Falklands with Argentina, and how that played into the fall of the Soviet Union, the fact that we demonstrated that we were not going to accept military incursions of this kind. And I think my concern is that the way that we have reacted to the situation in Ukraine and the way that we continue to react and the way that we have reacted since the invasion of Crimea until now has signalled weakness not only to China but also to Russia. And I think that that is a really big strategic mistake that we're going to end up paying for in the long term.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Emma Webb. Well, up next, we have at 4 o'clock Nana Akua on GBNews. Today, for her feature Outside, she'll be joined in the studio by one of the biggest names in the world of boxing, promoter and manager Kelly Maloney, who managed former world champion Lennox Lewis. She'll talk the highs and the lows of her time in boxing and how she lost when she announced her gender transition, formerly known as Frank. She says mates didn't understand her decision because there were real men's. Transition to Kelly Maloney and the reaction from the boxing world with Nana Akua here on GB News from 4 p.m. this afternoon. Well, thank you so much for joining me at the discussion. We'll be at the same time next week.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry with sunny spells for most, but rain edging in from the northwest. Let's take a look at those details. The southwest will end the day mostly dry with plenty of sunny spells on offer. The odd isolated light shower is possible, but it will be a fine evening for most. It will also be a fine and dry Sunday evening for the southeast. There'll be some fair weather cloud and plenty of sunny spells. Sunny spells will be plentiful across South Wales this evening too. Winds will be mainly light and there'll be a little fair weather cloud. There'll also be a little more cloud across the Midlands, but there'll also be some bright or sunny spells. An isolated light shower is possible, but for most it will remain dry. It's a different story across north-east England, where cloud will be increasing as rain gradually edges in from the north. The winds will also start to increase here through the evening. The wet weather will already be in place across southern Scotland this evening. The rain will be patchy in nature and turn heavy at times, with strong gusty winds too. Northern Ireland will also be cloudy, with patchy outbreaks of rain edging southeastwards through the evening. The winds will also be strengthening here, especially around coastal areas where gales are possible. The cloud, rain and strengthening winds will continue to edge steadily southeast overnight, reaching all areas by the morning. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss, and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is